Snow falls sideways over a longhouse in western Norway. Inside, the fire pit throws long shadows across 3 sleeping benches. A woman sits awake, mending a cloak that isn't hers. Down the hall, behind a woven partition, her husband sleeps beside another woman entirely. One who isn't his wife, and everyone in the hall knows it, and nobody says a word. That wasn't a scandal. That was Tuesday. So here's the question people almost never ask about Vikings. Did they actually believe in one partner? Not the sanitized version you got from the History Channel, the real one. Viking marriage wasn't really about love, and for a huge slice of Norse society, it wasn't about exclusivity either. Monogamy existed, but mostly as a rule for people who couldn't afford not to follow it. And that gap between what the law said and what the powerful actually did tells you almost everything about how Norse society actually worked. Start with what marriage even was in Viking Age Scandinavia, because it wasn't a wedding in the way you're picturing. A Norse marriage was closer to a merger between 2 farms than a union between 2 hearts. Families negotiated a bride price, the munder, paid by the groom's family to the brides. The bride brought her own property, the Heimskringla, which stayed legally hers even after the wedding. Norse women, unlike most of medieval Europe, could own land, divorce their husbands, and reclaim their dowry if the marriage failed. On paper, that sounds almost progressive. But the marriage itself wasn't chosen by the couple. It was arranged by fathers, brothers, or clan leaders, sealed with property and alliance in mind. Love, if it happened, was a bonus. Loyalty to the household, not to a spouse's bed, was the actual expectation. And that distinction matters, because once you understand marriage as a contract between families rather than a romantic bond between 2 people, the next part stops being shocking. It starts making a grim kind of sense. Because officially, socially, a Norse man could have exactly 1 wife. Icelandic law, recorded generations later in the Gragas Code, is explicit about that. 1 wife. But the law had a quiet asterisk sitting right underneath it. A wife and a concubine were not the same thing under Norse law, and that difference was written down on purpose. The Frostathing law, one of the oldest surviving Norwegian legal codes, spells out the rules around a frilla. A concubine, usually a woman of lower status, sometimes a captured or purchased slave, kept openly in a wealthy man's household alongside his wife. The children of a frilla had fewer inheritance rights than the children of a proper wife, but they still had rights. They weren't hidden. They weren't shameful secrets. They were written into inheritance law because everyone expected them to exist. Here's the detail that should stop you. This wasn't rare or fringe behavior. It was common enough among the wealthy and powerful that the legal system built an entire tier of children's rights around it. You don't legislate for something unless it's happening constantly. But there's a name attached to this pattern that makes it impossible to dismiss as legend. King Harald Fairhair, the man credited, however imperfectly, with unifying Norway around the year 872, is recorded in the sagas as having had somewhere between 9 and 12 wives and concubines over the course of his life, producing more than 20 children. The Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson's saga collection, written roughly 3 centuries later, names several of them directly. Gyda, Åsa, Svanhild, Ragnhild, the Mighty. Some historians treat the exact number with healthy skepticism. Sagas love a round, impressive figure, but the underlying pattern is corroborated across multiple independent sources, and it isn't unique to Harald. This wasn't scandal. This was strategy. Each marriage or concubinage bound Harald to a different regional family, a different set of allies, a different chunk of contested Norwegian coastline. Multiple partners weren't a personal indulgence for a king. They were a diplomatic tool, the Viking Age equivalent of a trade agreement, except the terms were written in bloodlines instead of tariffs. And it wasn't only Norwegian kings doing this. Travel 2,000 miles southeast, and an outsider watching the Norse up close described something even more explicit. In the year 921, an Arab diplomat and scholar named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled north along the Volga River and encountered a group of Norse traders the local sources called the Rus, Scandinavians, who had settled deep into what's now Russia. Ibn Fadlan wrote down what he saw with the careful, slightly startled detail of a man taking field notes on a culture he genuinely didn't understand. He described wealthy Rus merchants keeping 10, 20, even 40 enslaved women at once. Some kept purely for trade, others functioning as concubines within the household. He watched, in a scene that's now one of the most cited passages in all of Viking Age scholarship, the funeral of a Russ chieftain, where one of his slave concubines volunteered, or was pressured into volunteering, to die alongside him and join him in the next life. It's graphic, it's disturbing, and historians still argue about how representative it actually was of Norse life back in Scandinavia itself versus the specific, wealth-soaked trading culture of the Russ. But here's what's not in dispute. Ibn Fadlan wasn't describing a fringe oddity. He was describing standard practice among the men he considered the wealthiest and most respected in that community. The more resources a man controlled, the more women were attached to his household, as wives, as concubines, as property, sometimes all three categories blurring into one deeply uncomfortable reality. So by this point, the pattern across every single source, Icelandic law, Norwegian royal genealogy, an Arab traveler's first-hand account, is consistent. Monogamy in Viking society wasn't really a moral value. It was closer to an economic ceiling. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because that ceiling wasn't about virtue at all. It was about money. A poor Norse farmer had exactly one partner for the same reason he had exactly one house and one boat, because he could only afford one. Feeding, housing, and legally providing for a wife and children already stretched a modest household to its limit. A second woman, whether wife or concubine, meant a second mouth, a second set of children with inheritance claims, a second obligation the family's land and livestock simply couldn't support. For the average Norseman, monogamy wasn't a belief. It was a budget. But wealth erased that ceiling entirely. A chieftain, a jarl, a king, men who controlled enough land, enough livestock, enough captured slaves and trade goods, could afford as many households as they could support. And they did, openly, legally, with inheritance law written specifically to accommodate the children that resulted. Which means the real dividing line in Viking Age relationships wasn't ethics. It wasn't religion. Christianity hadn't yet reshaped Norse marriage law when most of this was happening. It wasn't even culture, not really. It was simply this. Could you afford more than one household? Or couldn't you? Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything Hollywood has sold you about Vikings. The image is always the same. The fierce warrior and his one devoted shield-maiden wife, loyal unto death, straight out of a streaming drama. And sure, plenty of Norse marriages probably looked something like that. Most Vikings weren't kings. Most Vikings were farmers, fishermen, and traders scraping by on modest land. And for them, one partner wasn't a romantic ideal. It was simply what they could afford, full stop. But the men writing the sagas, the men whose names survive in law codes and genealogies, the men Ibn Fadlan traveled thousands of miles to actually observe, those men lived by a completely different arithmetic. For them, a household wasn't a marriage. It was a small, expanding economy, and every additional woman inside it was both a resource and an alliance. Here's the uncomfortable modern echo, and it's not subtle. Strip away the swords and the longhouses, and what you're actually looking at is a society where relationship structure tracked almost perfectly with net worth. The wealthy operated by one set of rules. Everyone else operated by another. We'd like to think that particular pattern died with the Viking Age. It didn't. It just stopped being written into law and started being quietly understood instead. So, did Vikings have one partner? Some did, and meant it, in the same imperfect, complicated way people mean it today. But treat monogamy as some kind of universal Norse value, and you're flattening a society that was, in practice, deeply stratified by wealth in exactly this area of life. Icelandic law protected the idea of one wife. Norwegian law simultaneously carved out permanent space for concubines. A Viking king could father 20 children across 9 or 10 women and call it statecraft. A Viking farmer got one partner because that's what one small plot of frozen land could sustain. Tonight, when you think about commitment or fidelity or what a household is supposed to look like, it's worth remembering that the rules were never really about morality, not for the Norse and maybe not for anyone. They were, and often still are, about what you can afford, who you can protect, and who benefits from you believing the arrangement was always simple. We don't know exactly how most ordinary Norse people felt about the households built above them. The sagas were written by and about the powerful, not the poor. But the law they left behind speaks plainly enough on its own.